Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. A few weeks ago, I wrote about the Middle East over on Substack, specifically looking towards the future. In this discussion, I argued that there were three potential paths forward. The first being a managed de-escalation, the second being a controlled escalation, and the third being an uncontrolled escalation. My base case out of these three potential scenarios was that we would see an uncontrolled escalation in the Middle East. I could have seen a managed de-escalation with the United States exiting the conflict and trying to paint it as a win, but as the weeks progressed and we saw greater escalation, de-escalation seemed less likely than before. A few days ago, when we saw Trump threaten to, quote, wipe out an entire civilization, it was easy to assume that this uncontrolled escalation would spiral even further out of control. But then, rather unexpectedly, we saw the announcement of a 2-week ceasefire. This came out of the blue, and so in today's episode, I'm going to discuss how this ceasefire came about and what the key details of this agreement are. We'll then discuss whether this ceasefire will lead to a permanent peace or if we will see a return to war. Early last week, specifically on March 31st, we received reports that China and Pakistan were pursuing mediation for the conflict in the Middle East. They proposed a 5-part peace plan with the following criteria. Firstly, an immediate end to the hostilities. A start of peace talks would be pursued. The security of non-military targets would be guaranteed, as well as the security of shipping lanes, and finally, the primacy of the UN Charter. In the days that followed, Iran stated that they were unwilling to meet directly with US negotiators and that talks were at a dead end. If we consider the point of view of the Iranians, before the war, the scenario of a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz was unthinkable because 90% of Iran's crude exports travelled from Karg Island into the wider world through the Strait of Hormuz. If Hormuz was blocked, this would restrict 90% of Iran's crude exports. Economically, this would hit them hard. But if we fast forward to today, Iran has control of the Strait of Hormuz. Nations are coming to the Iranians to negotiate on transit deals, and Iran is seemingly sticking to its guns with regard to the toll payments for any vessel that is transiting the Strait of Hormuz. When it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, Donald Trump has attempted to downplay how important the strait is to the United States. The United States is energy self-sufficient when it comes to crude oil and natural gas, but the Persian Gulf is vital for more than crude oil and natural gas. Diesel and jet fuel are two of the refined products hit hardest by the closure of the strait, and this will affect prices at the pump, as well as airfares globally. Both of these will hurt Trump domestically in the United States and his chances in the midterm elections that are coming up in November. Trump was pulled into this conflict by the Israelis, who were going to launch preemptive strikes against the Iranians. But the United States has been kept in this conflict by the Iranians because they weren't incentivized to stop fighting because they had more cards than they had before, specifically surrounding their control of the Strait of Hormuz. The regime also remains in place despite the assassination of Khamenei, and Iran's energy influence has been realised all around the world. The blockade of Hormuz has seen nations pursue deals directly with Iran that are strongly favourable to Iran. And so, this is why I question why a ceasefire arose. Iran, despite feeling pain in some areas, was seemingly doing better off at withstanding this pain than the United States was. So, why did this ceasefire arise? The main reason that I can gauge as to why this 2-week ceasefire did arise was China. China is the world's factory. If there is less crude oil globally, that means less trade. Less trade means less income for China at a time when its real estate sector remains strained, and China is having to provide stimulus despite high levels of local government debt. China also relies on the Strait of Hormuz for 40% of its crude imports. So I believe it was the Chinese who have pushed the Iranians into this 2-week ceasefire agreement. But now that we're in this ceasefire agreement, we need to look at the views of the Iranians and of the Americans and what their plans are as we move forward towards a potential peace or a collapse of this ceasefire agreement. First, we'll discuss the plan of the Iranians. Iran's plan includes a US commitment to non-aggression, the lifting of all primary and secondary sanctions, the withdrawal of US combat forces from the Middle East, the US acceptance of Iran's uranium enrichment rights, the termination of all UN Security Council and International Atomic Energy Agency resolutions against Iran. The plan also includes full compensation for war damages that Iran will collect via shipping fees for vessels that transit the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians also want an end to the hostilities in Lebanon, Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz to be maintained, and the release of frozen Iranian assets. Many points from this plan were released a few weeks ago, to which Trump and the United States responded, saying that they were completely unfeasible. Then, in the last few days, when this ceasefire agreement emerged, Trump said that many points from the plan were workable. This is ultimately because Trump and the United States need a ceasefire. Their losses have been greater than anticipated because they expected a quick war. They didn't expect to be held in an escalatory spiral in a conflict that they themselves were part of instigating. When we look at the conditions of Iran's plan, it suggests that they are emboldened by their relative success in controlling the Strait of Hormuz and in squeezing global energy markets. Iran also has power in negotiations and in this conflict because the longer the Strait of Hormuz is closed, the more severe the effects on global energy markets, on food markets, and on global inflation will be. Before the conflict, Iran wouldn't have asked for these conditions because the United States would have rejected them all outright. Yet, here we are in a changed geopolitical environment due to the US actions against Iran. Iran's demands make it clear that they are seeking to formalise the perceived gains from this conflict, especially in energy leverage, regional influence, and nuclear autonomy. When it comes to Iran's nuclear industry, Trump cancelled the JCPOA, which was the previous nuclear deal that was held with Iran. He cancelled this because he believed he could achieve a better deal. If offered the JCPOA today, it would be a significantly more attractive deal than anything that's on the table as a part of these negotiations. So, with the US's war not as successful as they hoped, let's now have a look at their 15-point plan. The US plan includes a 30-day ceasefire, the dismantling of Iran's nuclear facilities in Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordo, a permanent commitment from Iran to never develop nuclear weapons, the handover of Iran's enriched uranium to the International Atomic Energy Agency, allowing the International Atomic Energy Agency to monitor all of the country's remaining nuclear infrastructure, Iran being allowed no uranium enrichment within the country's borders. The US plan also includes limits on the range and number of Iranian missiles, Iran ending its support for its regional proxies, and Iran ending the strikes on regional energy facilities of other countries in the Gulf. The final points in the US plan are the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, the removal of all sanctions on Iran, the ending of the UN mechanism that would allow sanctions to be reimposed on Iran, and US support for electricity generation at Iran's Bushehr civil nuclear plant. Despite Trump saying that the Iranian plan is workable, I see some clear areas in the US plan where negotiation will be difficult, if not impossible, because some of the criteria in the two plans are complete opposites of each other. One such area where the plans clash is over the status of uranium and Iran's nuclear industry. Iran wants the United States to accept its rights to enrich uranium, while the United States wants Iran to cede all uranium enrichment. Also, Iran's plan wants to end the fighting in Lebanon, but Israel continues to strike southern Lebanon. Iran responded to Israel's strikes a few days ago by reclosing the Strait of Hormuz and by launching strikes against energy infrastructure in the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait. They also attacked desalination plants in Kuwait. Another area of the plan that is unlikely is the United States to remove all combat troops from the Middle East, especially because an emboldened Iran could continue to strike its neighbours and its energy infrastructure, and the United States would want to be in the region to defend its interests. In the last day, Trump has stated that US military assets will remain in the region throughout the entirety of this ceasefire negotiation. But if we look big picture, the United States' overseas bases are how the Americans continue to export their military strength globally. They're not going to give up this card. Finally, Trump has stated that he wants a joint solution for the Strait of Hormuz, where both Iran and the United States will manage the flow of traffic through the strait. In the last day, Trump has also stated that he is against the toll system that the Iranians are currently enacting on the strait. This is an area of clear difference between the two plans, because the United States having influence over the Strait of Hormuz isn't in line with Iran wanting all US combat forces removed from the Middle East. Secondly, Iran has demonstrated that it can block and thus control flows through the Strait of Hormuz by itself. Why would they allow the United States to gain any level of control here? If we couple this with the Houthi strikes in the Red Sea and the Bab al-Mandab Strait, and Iran has the potential to pressure global shipping massively, they wouldn't be incentivized to give up this card and their control of the Strait of Hormuz unless they were receiving a better offer from the United States in return. This could be sanctions relief, but I can't see the Iranians giving up this control. These areas of difference between the two plans are points that would need to be negotiated if a permanent ceasefire was to arise. But with this being said, is a successful negotiation likely between the Iranians and the United States, or will we see this ceasefire collapse? When I discussed future scenarios in the Middle East that could unfold a few weeks ago, I included a principle from Ray Dalio. This principle states that wars that end must have winners and losers. If the winners and losers aren't clear, the war continues. At the time of discussing this quote, I argued that the Iranians could be more resilient than the United States had expected. I also stated that the United States was paying for its active involvement in this conflict with costs that were too high to sustain for a prolonged period. When the costs grow too high in a conflict, the side paying these high costs will seek an off-ramp. In this conflict, it was the United States and Trump that were seeking an off-ramp. This is why, over the last few weeks, Trump's rhetoric has grown more chaotic and aggressive. On the flip side, Iran has gained control of the Strait of Hormuz and is receiving compensation from nations for any vessels that transit the strait. In other ways, the Iranians are likely being squeezed, but they have clearly withstood pain better than the United States has in this conflict, and Hormuz has become how they will leverage this in negotiations. The war has also hurt Trump domestically, with his approval rating in the 30s, and it's hurt him internationally because trust continues to decline in the United States, as I also discussed over on Substack last week. Because the United States didn't incite regime change or destroy Iran's nuclear enrichment capabilities, it's difficult to determine many areas, if any, where the United States has come out on top in this conflict. And so, if the United States was being squeezed and was seeking an off-ramp, why did Iran agree to this temporary ceasefire? As I stated earlier, it could have been China working behind the scenes, or perhaps the United States' hard power and its escalating threats did finally pressure Iran to pursue a ceasefire. It's notable that Iran previously rejected a temporary ceasefire agreement earlier this week, so something has clearly changed to contribute to the Iranians' shift in stance. For now, these questions as to the motive of the Iranians are difficult to answer, but in the next 2 weeks we will likely discover answers. As we look forward to whether this ceasefire agreement ends in success or failure, there are two main scenarios. Either this ceasefire will hold, or it will be extended, and negotiations towards a deal will continue to occur. We will then know what the geopolitical reality on the ground will look like in the Middle East, and where the United States and Iran will be willing to shift their stance in regard to the conditions in their individual plans for peace. Or the second scenario is that this ceasefire is fragile and it collapses. Israel could continue to aggress against other nations in the Middle East, specifically Lebanon. And Iran and Pakistan have stated that as a part of this ceasefire agreement, Lebanon is included. This ceasefire could also collapse if the United States and Iran aren't willing to shift their stances and negotiate with each other based on their individual plans. Despite this ceasefire agreement being between the United States and Iran, this conflict started because Israel was going to launch preemptive strikes against Iran once again. The United States got involved, and then the Iranians didn't want a ceasefire, so the United States was stuck in this conflict. The Iranians possessing enriched uranium that could make nuclear weapons is an existential risk for the Israelis. And so the Israelis are incentivized to continue fighting to progress towards this goal. As we look forward, this risks potentially dragging the United States back into this conflict once again, even if a ceasefire agreement is reached. In fact, this is another contributing reason as to why the two plans would be difficult to find a middle ground on, because the United States likely wouldn't agree to a non-aggression pact, because this would leave the Israelis on their own. And so, if this conflict in the Middle East is to fully stop, the Israelis need to be less incentivized to fight. This could come from securing the enriched uranium, or from a deal that sees Iran's uranium and nuclear industry monitored sufficiently. This would reduce incentives for the Israelis to fight, which would hence reduce the likelihood that the United States will be dragged in once again. If this conflict is to restart, one of the biggest questions is if we return to an environment where Iran is going to withstand pain and squeeze the United States, or if the United States would pursue such strong escalation that Iran would not be able to withstand the pain any longer. But for now, we continue to move through this period of ceasefire. This isn't a negotiation for peace. From the conditions in both plans, it's clear that this is a negotiation over the environment in the Middle East. And the Iranians and the Americans have different visions of what this world will look like. We'll keep up with the developments here over the coming weeks, but as I alluded to a few minutes ago, the biggest worry is that the United States gets dragged back into this conflict and that they will escalate dramatically to end the war so that they aren't stuck in a conflict paying high costs that they don't want to pay. Also, even if this conflict ends, there will be second-order effects that will create dramatic shifts in our geopolitical world that are likely already ingrained. Will we see nations seek to acquire nuclear weapons to protect themselves? Or could we perhaps see proxy conflicts emerge between the global superpowers? Finally, Has this conflict damaged Trump's midterm election hopes in November beyond the point of no return? It's these second-order effects and the status of this ceasefire that we will continue to discuss in coming weeks. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on the podcast platform of your choice. It really helps out the podcast. I've been Dylan, and I'll talk to you next time.